Hi everyone, welcome to MAR 4613. Today we're going to cover Chapter 11, which is summarizing your data. So at this point, we've kind of combed through all your data and we've looked at the different code books and the different data matrices, and now we're ready to start seeing what we can see and figuring out how we can properly summarize and analyze our data to provide the information to our business owner. At the end of today's lecture, you're going to be able to list the different data analyses used in marketing. You're going to select the appropriate measures of central tendency and variability for categorical and metric scales. You'll conduct the appropriate analyses for the categorical and metric scales using Excel Data Analyst, and we're going to recall the basic concepts about a normal distribution, something that we learned from basic stats way back when. So we are still in step 10 of our research process. Now, when we're talking about data analysis and we've gone through kind of the preliminary data checks that we talked about before, there's really four main types of data analyses that we use in marketing research. And the different types vary based on the research objective at hand. So the first kind is summarizing the data, and that's if our research objective is to just describe what it is that we're seeing within our sample. And we'll look at things like percentages and averages, and that's really what we're going to focus on today. The next type of analysis is generalization, and that's when we're looking at our research findings and determining whether or not we can project those findings out to our broader population. And the two things there will be a hypothesis test and confidence intervals, and that's something that we're going to cover off on in Chapter 12. Then we'll have differences, which is the third type of marketing research analysis, and that's really if we want to be able to compare two numbers together. So am I looking for meaningful differences between one statistic and another statistic? And we'll talk a little bit about that again in Chapter 12, although it's really covered in Chapter 13. And then finally we'll talk very quickly about some relationships. So how does what change in one variable impact a change in another variable? And that's what we're doing. We're talking about relationships or relating those variables in meaningful ways. And that would really be through crosstabs, correlations, and regression analysis. So those are the four main types. This chart is from your textbook, and what it does is it talks about how valuable each of the different types of analysis is based on the information that's provided, and that's what's on the vertical axis. And then across the bottom is the level of complexity for each of those different types of analyses. So we're going to focus on the first part today, which is really that summarizing or describing. Then the next series of lectures we'll talk about the generalizations, and then we'll kind of tip our toe in the water when we're talking about some differences and crosstabs or relationship type things. But you can see we're going to start with the lower level of information and the lowest level of complexity and kind of work our way up for these last few lectures in the course. So let's start with that first section, which was really the summarization analysis. So this is where I just want to describe what it is that I've seen in my data. And I'm either looking at different percentages or number of responses to a particular question and how they answered each answer set, or I'm looking at averages. So there's two main goals when we're talking about summarization analysis. The first is to find the central tendency, which really just describes the most typical response to a question. So what was the answer choice that was selected most often? That's the central tendency. The other is the measure of variability. So central tendency alone, just telling me which percentage or which statistic occurs most often, is really only part of the story. The other thing that I want to see is how did all of the other answer sets fall out in my data set for that particular question? Were they all kind of clumped together, or were they really spread out? So I'm talking about the degree of variability or that spread or range of responses across a particular answer set. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that, and I'll give you some examples. And when we're doing these calculations, just like some of the other calculations that we've done so far, they do vary depending on whether or not we're doing a categorical response question or whether we're doing a metric response question. And we'll go through both of those today. So when we're talking about the two main things in summarization, like I said, we have central tendency and we have variability. So first, if you're looking all the way on the left at the categorical scale, the main measure of central tendency in this response is the mode. And the mode is, again, if we remember from basic statistics, is the response that occurs most often. So that's how I'm looking at my central tendency. And then if I want to measure the variability, I just want to be able to look at the spread of all of the responses in a particular question. So in this example here, they just used the categorical question of gender. So you could either be male or female. And based on this sample set here and on this chart, the response that occurred the most often was female. So that's the mode. And you can see that if you move over to the right and you look at the variability, because you can see that 56% of our respondents were female and only 44% of our respondents were male. But together, the 56 and the 44 make up that 100%. So that's our range, because there's only two answer choices, male or female. Female occurred most often at 56%, which is why that's also our mode at central tendency. And then you can see the spread or the differences between the male and the female. The next type is for the metric scale. So in this case, when we're talking about a metric question and it's talking about central tendency, we look at the average. So what is the average for that number? So in this example, it's age, which we measured in years. So the average or central tendency for this example question was 45.4 years, central tendency. Then when we're talking about the variability of a metric question, here there's two things that we want to look at. We want to look at the range and we want to look at the standard deviation. So the range was, what was the lowest age of my respondent, in this example was 20 years, and my highest or my maximum was 75 years. So my full range, or you kind of think about my spread of variability, was from 20 to 75. And then I had a standard deviation of 6.3 years. Again, we're going to go into how to calculate all that, but just kind of a high-level overview of the differences between the two measures of summarization and how they're different based on a categorical scale or a metric scale. So let's take an example looking at a categorical question. Hopefully this question looks familiar to you because it was from the Intro to Marketing Research survey that I had you take all the way back in the beginning of week 1. And the question was, how familiar are you with marketing research? Please select one. So it was a single select question. This is a very standard table output where we're looking at two things. We have the rating scale or the answer sets here. So it was extremely familiar, very familiar, somewhat familiar, not very familiar, not at all familiar. And then it can tell me how many people who completed the survey answered that way. So nobody said that they were extremely familiar. 2 people said that they were very familiar. 9 people said they were somewhat familiar, 7 people said not very familiar, and 1 person said not at all familiar. So those are my response counts. So that just tells me of the 19 people who answered the survey, this is how each person answered this question. Then, moving over to the final column, you'll see a percentage. And all this does is take the response count and divide it by the total number of people who answered that question. So to get that 11% for very familiar, we take the 2 people who answered that question, divided by the 19, which is the total number of people who answered the question, to come up with 11%. Very standard. This is what's called a frequency distribution table, and it's giving you your response count as well as your percentage. When you're thinking about data or your report, you could potentially have something like this for all of the questions in your survey that are very, very important. Because notice there's only one question that's being listed here. So as your mind, while we're talking about analytics today, in the back of our mind, we should always be thinking about how are we going to interpret this data and communicate these results to my business owner or my marketing manager or the ultimate decision maker. So you'll have a lot of outputs like this. Imagine having almost one output graph like this for each of the different questions. So not only does this give us just the counts and the percentages, based on this information, we are able to figure out what the central tendency is for this question, as well as what the question's variability is. So let's look at that. So same exact data set, same question here. So the central tendency for a categorical question, like we talked about, is the mode, which is the response that occurs most often. And in this instance, 9 was the highest number for any response category, which was somewhat familiar. And so 47% of our respondents said that they were somewhat familiar. One thing that I want to note here is notice that 47 is not a 50% majority. It has nothing to do with if the majority of the people has to be 50% or higher. It's literally just looking at the counts and the one answer choice that occurs most often. So that's my central tendency, is the somewhat familiar. Most people tend to answer this question, somewhat familiar. And then my variability is the degree to which my responses are similar to one another, or kind of looking at that spread. So what I can see here, and why it's always good to look at counts as well, there's only a 2-person spread between somewhat familiar and not very familiar. 9 people versus 7 people. So the variability between those two answer choices is very small. But then the range on either side starts to get a little bit wider out when you start looking at the 2 people who said very familiar, or the 1 person on the other end who said not at all familiar. So between looking at the graphical representation of the bars and the response number counts and the percentages, you're able to calculate the central tendency and the variability for each individual question. So that's if you want to do it manually. Now, if we want to do it using our Excel data analyst, we can do that as well. So we'll open up that same data file. We would click on the Excel Data Analyst add-on. We would hover over Summarize. And in this case, we want to click on percents because we're using a categorical value. We'll select which values from within the survey we want to summarize, and then we'll click OK. And then you will get a standard output that looks very similar to the output I showed you with our survey, which I built in Qualtrics. These are some examples of some data visualizations, and so other ways that we can, when we're thinking about reporting, showcase that data. So we could show the original table that had the counts and the percents, and it was from extremely familiar to not at all familiar. A pie chart is a very popular format, and you always want to have the scale, or the actual percentage, as well as a label for what that scale is representing for that piece of the pie. Or you could do a bar chart. Personally, I like bar charts because then you can also start to see the curve of the distribution of the responses, but either is very acceptable when you're thinking about presenting these types of frequencies in categorical values. All right, now let's move on to the next section, which is doing the same type of exercise, but now we're going to do it for a metric variable. So the central tendency for a metric variable is the average. So the average is what typifies all of the responses of a metric. That doesn't always mean that the average is the true center of your data. So that's just something to keep in mind. But when we're thinking about central tendencies, the best way that we can kind of estimate for that is the average. And then in this case, there's 2 other things that we want to look at. One is the range, which is the distance between the lowest value and the highest value in a set of numbers. So this is a standard output from your Excel Data Analyst tool. And what it's showing you here is it's giving you the average, which is something that we need, which I think is 4.8. It's giving you the standard deviation, and then it's giving you your max and min, so that's your range from 1 to 7, and then your total sample size, which was 1,000 respondents. Notice that standard deviation is in the middle, and I mentioned already that standard deviation was one of the things that we needed for metric variables and summarization. So let's talk a little bit more about what we're talking about with standard deviation. So here, as in with most cases, standard deviation indicates the degree of variability in metric values in such a way that you can translate it onto a normal bell curve. A lot of words. Let's just look at the visual. So the visual here, your average is at the center of your bell curve, and then for market research purposes, 95% confidence is usually our industry standard. We want to make sure that 95% of our responses are going to fall within the allowable limit, which is minus 1.96 to plus 1.96 standard deviations from the average. So we're assuming that 95% of our survey responses are going to fall within that kind of green bell. And then the pink tails on either end, that's going to account for the other 5% of responses, 2.5 on the left and 2.5 on the right. So if you can kind of picture in your mind, if you have the average and you have the standard deviation, so plus or minus on either end, you can start to kind of visualize what your curve is going to look like. And so if you have a very narrow curve, meaning that it's not so spread out along that bottom axis there, then you have very limited or narrow variability, which is good. If your range is really, really wide and you have a much flatter looking distribution, then you have wide variability. So let's look at a metric example, again going from our intro survey. So we asked about how many hours per week are you able to spend completing the required reading and coursework for this class? This is the exact same type of output as you got from Excel Data Analyst, except the columns are just arranged a little bit differently. So the first thing that you have is your range. So you have your min and you have your max. You have your average and you have your standard deviation and your total number of responses. And now I have everything that I need with my metric variable to also calculate the central tendency and variability for this question. So let's do that. So here we talked about in a metric variable, the central tendency is the average. So I already know, based on the average value here, my central tendency is 5.36 hours. That's the average number of hours that people who answer this question think that they're going to spend per week on the required reading and coursework for this class. Now let's look at the variability, looking at my min and my max values. I go from a range of 2.7 all the way to 7.9. So think about that bell curve. That's a really wide range, or a really wide bell curve. So that means that I have a lot of variability here, because there's at least one student who's going to spend 2.7 hours, and there's at least one other student who's going to spend 7.9 hours. And part of the reason why this range is so wide and we have such a great degree of variability is because my sample size is so small. So if we would have had a much larger sample size, the range could have been tightened and the variability could have been lower. But I was just working with what we had at the time. Again, you can summarize this in Excel Data Analyst. The process is almost the same, so you'll go to your spreadsheet, you'll go to Excel Data Analyst add-ons, click on or hover over Summarize, and this time though, make sure that you do averages instead of percents, because we're now summarizing a metric response. Select the variables that you want to summarize and click OK. Okay, that concludes the first section really when we're talking about summarizing our data, or most of the sections. So as I said before, summarizing is a great first step in the data analysis, but if you remember that chart that we talked about, which shows the level of information over the level of complexity, it's a lower level degree of information and a lower degree of complexity. That information needs to be presented. Business managers and decision makers want that information, but the next series of lectures is really going to talk about how can we go to the next level with our analysis and start looking at things that we can now take those percentages or those sample statistics and project them out, so generalizing our data, and then how can we look at some crosstabs to look for relationships or look for meaningful differences between different subgroups to bring even more insights to our decision makers. Thanks so much for watching.